Today we're diving deep into the most disturbing occult rituals of the medieval church, the forbidden practices that the institution itself desperately tried to hide from history. While we know the church for its holy doctrine and sacred ceremonies, there exists a much darker chapter filled with Vatican exorcism torture, ritualistic ceremonies, and systematic cover-ups of demonic possession. Before we continue, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? I love connecting with fellow seekers of hidden knowledge. The medieval church wielded absolute spiritual authority over millions of souls, controlling not just earthly politics but claiming dominion over the supernatural realm itself. Yet behind cathedral walls, clergy engaged in practices that would make even seasoned occultists recoil. In the basement chambers of Notre Dame Cathedral, priests conducted what they called purification rituals that involved heated iron brands and forced consumption of mysterious substances made from ground bone and mercury. The Abbey of Saint Denis kept detailed records of children who entered their spiritual cleansing ceremonies, but never emerged the same. Many were found weeks later in nearby forests, completely mute and bearing strange burn marks and geometric patterns across their bodies. The monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy housed what church records referred to as the Chamber of Divine Correction, a stone room 30 feet underground where priests performed exorcisms that lasted for days without stopping. Survivors described being strapped to wooden crosses while clergy chanted in languages that weren't Latin, surrounded by candles arranged in symbols that bore no resemblance to traditional Christian imagery. The Vatican's own archives contain testimonies from the 13th century describing rituals where possessed individuals were forced to drink mixtures containing human blood, supposedly to strengthen their resistance to demonic influence. What drove these holy men to such extremes? How did exorcism become systematic torture? How did the institution that preached love and forgiveness develop techniques that involve slowly burning religious symbols into living flesh? And what were they really trying to achieve through these disturbing rituals that often resulted in death rather than healing? The evidence suggests these weren't desperate attempts to save souls, but calculated efforts to extract supernatural knowledge for the church's own purposes. Join us as we uncover the most shocking secrets and forbidden practices of the medieval church's dark occult underground. To understand these disturbing practices, we must first examine how the medieval church accumulated unprecedented spiritual power between the 4th and 15th centuries, and how that power gradually corrupted into something unrecognizable from its original mission. If you're fascinated by hidden religious history like this, make sure to subscribe. We uncover these forbidden topics every week. The transformation began with Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD, but the real foundation for these dark practices came much later, through specific documents and secret teachings that most people have never heard of. The first major step toward institutionalized occult practices was Pope Gregory the Great's dialogues, written around 593 AD. This text detailed graphic accounts of supernatural encounters and established the first official protocols for dealing with demonic forces. Gregory described cases where exorcism required what he called physical persuasion techniques that involved restraining possessed individuals and using heated metal objects to drive demons from their hiding places in human flesh. The book contained detailed descriptions of successful exorcisms that involved methods modern readers would recognize as torture, but Gregory presented them as divine inspiration. But it was the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, that truly codified the Church's authority over supernatural forces and provided the blueprint for centuries of abuse. This book, written by two German Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, contained detailed instructions for identifying, capturing, and extracting confessions from those possessed by demons. What most people don't know is that it also included specific torture techniques that were considered religiously acceptable because they were performed by clergy rather than civil authorities. The book described how to use devices called blessed restraints, iron shackles that had been consecrated through special ceremonies involving the blood of martyred saints. The Malleus also introduced the concept of spiritual interrogation, which involved techniques designed to break down mental resistance. These included sleep deprivation lasting up to 2 weeks, forced consumption of substances that caused hallucinations, and exposure to temperatures that pushed the human body to its limits. All of these were justified as necessary to weaken demonic hold over possessed individuals. The book provided detailed schedules for these interrogations, specifying that the most effective sessions occurred between midnight and dawn, when the barrier between spiritual realms was thinnest. The Church positioned itself as humanity's sole intermediary between the physical and spiritual realms, claiming exclusive rights to combat demonic forces. With this authority came immense wealth, political power, and most dangerously, absolute secrecy. By the 12th century, bishops commanded armies of specialized exorcists who answered only to Vatican authorities. These weren't regular priests. They underwent secret training in monasteries like Monte Cassino in Italy, Cluny in France, and the Abbey of Saint Victor in Paris, where they learned techniques that were never written in any public religious text. The training process itself was disturbing. Novice exorcists were required to witness actual torture sessions before being allowed to participate. They studied anatomy not to heal, but to understand how to inflict maximum pain without causing immediate death. They learned to read facial expressions and body language to determine when subjects were close to breaking, and they memorized specific prayers that were supposed to be recited during moments of extreme suffering. Most shocking of all, they were taught to identify vessels of spiritual knowledge, individuals whose suffering could supposedly reveal hidden supernatural secrets. Historical records from the Vatican's secret archives, which weren't open to researchers until 1881, revealed that certain monasteries housed specialized purification chambers deep underground. The monastery of San Miniato in Florence contained what church records called chambers of divine justice, windowless stone rooms equipped with restraining devices and heating apparatus for metal implements. These rooms were designed with specific acoustic properties that amplified screams, based on the belief that louder cries of pain were more effective at driving out demonic forces. The Abbey of Cluny maintained detailed logs of individuals brought for spiritual correction, with survival rates that modern historians find deeply disturbing. Out of 847 documented cases, between 1203 and 1298, only 23 individuals were recorded as being successfully purified and released. The rest were listed as having joined the eternal struggle against darkness. Church euphemism for death during the process? Even more disturbing, the records show that children made up nearly 40% of these cases. Justified by church doctrine claiming that demonic forces preferred to inhabit innocent vessels. The Cathedral of Reims in France housed what was called the Archive of Supernatural Testimony, a collection of confessions extracted during these sessions. These documents, discovered during renovations in 1876, contained detailed accounts of supposed demonic knowledge that victims had revealed under torture. The confessions described hidden, supernatural hierarchies, locations of demonic gatherings, and most disturbingly, lists of other individuals who were supposedly possessed. Modern analysis of these documents reveals that they were likely fabricated by the clergy themselves, creating an endless cycle where torture victims were forced to name others, who were then captured and tortured in turn. During the height of medieval power, the church operated parallel to civil authority, maintaining its own courts, prisons, and execution methods. What made these practices particularly sinister was how they were justified through sophisticated theological arguments. Church doctrine claimed that physical suffering could purify the soul and drive out demonic influences. This created a perfect cover for systematic abuse. Torture became a sacrament, screaming became prayer, and death became salvation. The church developed an entire theological framework around what they called redemptive suffering, arguing that pain inflicted by holy hands was fundamentally different from worldly torture. The most disturbing aspect was how these practices became clergy who participated in these rituals were required to undergo their own purification ceremonies to prevent demonic contamination. These sessions, while less severe than what they inflicted on others, created a culture of normalized abuse. Within church hierarchy, priests became conditioned to associate suffering with spiritual achievement, creating generations of clergy who saw torture as a normal part of religious practice. The legacy of these practices would haunt the institution for centuries, creating a shadow network of forbidden knowledge that church authorities have spent over 500 years trying to suppress and deny. Documents from this period were deliberately destroyed during the Counter-Reformation, but enough survived in hidden archives to paint a picture of systematic abuse that was far more extensive and organized than most people could imagine. The techniques developed during this period established templates for institutional control, an abuse that would echo through history, influencing not just religious institutions but any organization that claimed moral authority while operating in absolute secrecy. The physical reality of these rituals was far more disturbing than any Hollywood depiction could capture, and the deliberate design of these torture chambers reveals the calculated psychology behind medieval church abuse. Medieval exorcism chambers were deliberately constructed to break both body and spirit through environmental manipulation that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic sensory torture. These weren't crude dungeon cells, but carefully engineered spaces designed by church architects who understood how physical environment could be weaponized against the human mind. The most infamous of these chambers was located beneath the Cathedral of Chartres in France. Discovered during foundation repairs in 1194, after a fire damaged the upper structure, the chamber was a perfect circle, 15 feet in diameter, carved directly into bedrock 40 feet below the cathedral floor. The walls were covered in religious symbols that had been carved backwards and upside down, creating a disorienting effect. For anyone brought into the space, the ceiling was designed as a dome with a single opening at the center, through which a rope could be lowered to suspend victims in various positions. Stone rooms, deep beneath cathedrals, were lit only by flickering candles arranged in precise geometric patterns that served multiple purposes. The positioning created moving shadows that made the chamber appear to shift and change, adding to the psychological pressure on victims. But more disturbing was the discovery that these candle arrangements weren't random. They followed specific mathematical formulas that church records called sacred geometries of purification. Analysis of surviving chamber layouts shows that the candle positions were calculated to create optical illusions that made victims believe the walls were closing in, or that demonic figures were moving in the shadows. The tools themselves revealed the true nature of these practices and the sophisticated understanding of human anatomy that clergy possessed. Iron restraints weren't simple shackles, but complex devices that had been blessed with holy water in ceremonies that lasted 3 days. These restraints were designed to apply pressure to specific nerve points that maximized pain while preventing unconsciousness. Leather straps used to bind victims were inscribed with Latin incantations, but analysis of surviving examples shows that many contained phrases that weren't actually Latin at all, but combinations of words designed to sound mystical while being completely meaningless. Most chilling were the specialized torture devices that priests claimed were divinely inspired. The Malleus Maleficarum describes ceremonial knives with handles carved from the bones of saints, blessed chains that had been forged during lunar eclipses, and purification rods, metal implements that were heated in sacred fires until they glowed red. But church records reveal even more disturbing details about these tools. The knives were designed with specific blade angles that created wounds which bled profusely but weren't immediately fatal. The chains contained links of different metals that created chemical reactions when heated, producing colors that priests claimed revealed the presence of demonic forces. The purification rods were perhaps the most sadistic invention. These weren't simple heated metal bars, but sophisticated instruments with hollow chambers that could be filled with different substances. Church records describe rods filled with molten silver for purifying demonic corruption, others filled with blessed oils that burst into flame when the rod reached certain temperatures, and most disturbingly, rods containing mixtures of ground, bone and mercury that released toxic vapors when heated. Victims described the sensation as being burned both inside and outside their bodies simultaneously. Witnesses who survived these sessions described an atmosphere of dread that announced these rituals before they even began. The smell was always the first warning, burning incense mixed with something far less holy that survivors consistently described as similar to rotting meat. Modern analysis suggests this odor came from previous sessions, as church records indicate that chambers were rarely cleaned between uses, allowing the smell of burned flesh and spilled blood to permeate the stone permanently. The sound was equally disturbing. Latin chants that seemed to twist into something darker weren't imagination but deliberate vocal techniques that clergy learned during their secret training. These chants were designed to create dissonance and acoustic effects that induced panic in listeners. The priests deliberately altered traditional prayers by changing pitch and rhythm in ways that made familiar words sound threatening and alien. Some chants were performed in rounds, with multiple voices overlapping to create an effect that victims described as sounding like multiple conversations happening at once, making it impossible to focus on any single voice. The presence of multiple clergy dressed not in white robes, but in black vestments, reserved for these secret ceremonies, added to the psychological assault. These weren't standard religious garments, but specially designed costumes intended to intimidate and disorient. The black robes were decorated with silver symbols that reflected candlelight in deliberate patterns, creating the illusion that the figures were surrounded by moving lights. The hoods were designed to completely obscure the wearer's face while amplifying their voice, making the clergy seem less human and more like supernatural entities themselves. The protocols were specific and disturbing. Following procedures that had been refined over centuries of practice, victims were bound in positions that mimicked crucifixion, not out of religious symbolism but because these positions caused maximum physical stress while keeping the victim conscious longer. They were forced to consume holy substances that induced hallucinations, mixtures that church alchemists had developed specifically for these purposes. Analysis of surviving recipes shows these contained combinations of ergot, fungus, mercury, compounds, and various plant toxins that caused violent vomiting, seizures, and terrifying visual hallucinations. The psychological torture disguised as spiritual cleansing followed specific timelines, designed to break mental resistance systematically. Sessions began with hours of sensory deprivation in complete darkness and silence, followed by sudden exposure to bright lights and loud sounds. Victims were then subjected to temperature extremes, alternating between freezing cold and intense heat from heated metal implements. Throughout this process, clergy maintained that they were saving the victim's soul, creating a psychological contradiction that many survivors never recovered from. The paradox was intentional and carefully calculated. Pain inflicted in God's name, suffering sanctified as salvation. Church documents reveal that clergy were specifically trained to present torture as an act of divine love, constantly reassuring victims that their suffering was necessary for spiritual purification. This created a psychological prison where victims couldn't distinguish between help and harm, making resistance nearly impossible and recovery extremely difficult even for those who survived. These physical manifestations weren't accidents of medieval ignorance or the result of primitive medical understanding. They were deliberate psychological warfare techniques designed to extract confessions, break resistance, and demonstrate the Church's absolute power over both body and soul. The sophistication of these methods suggests that Church authorities understood human psychology far better than most people realize, and used that knowledge to create systems of abuse that were both physically devastating and psychologically inescapable. The medieval Church claimed dominion over supernatural forces through a complex hierarchy of spiritual powers that went far beyond traditional prayer, and the evidence suggests these weren't just religious beliefs but organized systems for extracting information and maintaining control through supernatural terror. The Church developed what modern investigators would recognize as a sophisticated intelligence network that used claims of divine authority to justify practices that were actually elaborate psychological operations designed to gather information and eliminate opposition. At the apex were the cardinal exorcists clergy, who claimed direct communion with archangels and possessed the authority to bind or release demonic entities. But Church records reveal that these individuals underwent secret consecrations that were far more disturbing than simple religious ceremonies. The process, known as divine ordination of the sacred warriors, required candidates to spend 40 days in underground chambers experiencing controlled torture designed to break their earthly attachments. Survivors of this process describe being kept in sensory deprivation for weeks, forced to consume hallucinogenic substances, and subjected to psychological techniques that left many permanently changed. These cardinal exorcists claimed what they called divine immunity, the ability to confront supernatural forces without spiritual contamination. Church documents describe this immunity as the result of having their souls branded by divine fire, a process that involved actual branding with heated metal implements bearing religious symbols. But more disturbing evidence suggests this immunity was actually the result of psychological conditioning that made these individuals capable of inflicting extreme suffering without emotional response. They had been systematically trained to disconnect from human empathy, making them perfect instruments for institutional abuse. The Church's arsenal included 5 primary supernatural authorities that reveal the organized nature of their operations. First was the power of compulsion, forcing demonic entities to reveal hidden knowledge through ritualistic torture of possessed individuals. Church records describe specific techniques for extracting information during exorcism sessions, including methods for determining when victims were lying and procedures for breaking down mental resistance. What's particularly disturbing is that these records contain detailed information about political figures, trade secrets, and family scandals that suggest the demonic knowledge being extracted was actually intelligence gathered through systematic torture and coercion. The Abbey of St. Denis maintained what they called the Archive of Compelled Revelations, thousands of documents containing information supposedly revealed by demons during exorcisms. Modern analysis of these records shows they contain detailed intelligence about political alliances, military plans, and economic activities that would have been extremely valuable to Church authorities. The information was far too specific and accurate to have been supernatural in origin, suggesting that the exorcism process was actually an elaborate cover for extracting information from captured enemies, political rivals, and anyone else the Church wanted to investigate. Second was the ability of transference, moving demonic influences from one vessel to another, often using children as pure vessels for containment. Church documents describe this process in clinical detail that reveals its true nature as systematic child abuse. Children were selected based on specific criteria, including age, family status, and physical characteristics. They were then subjected to purification rituals that prepared them to receive transferred demonic influences. Survivors' accounts describe being isolated from their families, subjected to starvation and sleep deprivation, and forced to participate in ceremonies where they witnessed extreme violence inflicted on other victims. The transference process itself involved elaborate ceremonies where children were made to believe they were helping save possessed adults. By accepting demonic influences into themselves, this created a psychological trap where victims became willing participants in their own abuse, believing they were performing acts of Christian charity. Church records show that children who underwent transference rarely survived more than a few months, with most dying from what documents euphemistically describe as spiritual exhaustion. Third came soul binding, permanently trapping spiritual entities within consecrated objects or living hosts. This practice reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Church operations, as it involved creating what were essentially human prisoners who were kept alive indefinitely for the purpose of containing supposed supernatural forces. The monastery of Cluny maintained special chambers for bound vessels, individuals who had been subjected to soul-binding rituals, and were kept in permanent captivity. These bound vessels were described in Church records as being in a state between life and death, conscious but unable to speak or move freely. They were fed minimal amounts of food and water, just enough to keep them alive, and were subjected to regular maintenance rituals designed to reinforce their binding. Visitors to these chambers described seeing dozens of individuals chained to walls, completely silent and showing signs of long-term malnutrition and abuse. Church authorities claimed these people were serving a holy purpose by containing demonic forces, but the evidence suggests they were actually victims of systematic torture, who had been psychologically broken to the point where they could no longer resist. Forth came the most disturbing practice: sacrificial purification. Vatican records reference ceremonies where offerings of innocence were made to strengthen the Church's supernatural defenses. The euphemistic language barely conceals the horrific reality of what these rituals entailed. Church documents describe elaborate ceremonies conducted during specific astronomical events, where individuals described as pure vessels were subjected to ritual murder, disguised as spiritual sacrifice. The Cathedral of Reims maintained detailed records of these sacrificial ceremonies, including lists of participants, specific procedures followed, and supposed supernatural results achieved. The records show that victims were selected based on age, gender, and what church authorities called spiritual purity criteria. That typically meant young people from families with no political connections who wouldn't be missed. The ceremonies themselves followed specific protocols that involved days of preparation, elaborate costumes and settings, and methods of killing that were designed to maximize suffering while maintaining the appearance of religious ritual. Finally, they claimed temporal authority over supernatural forces, the ability to command demonic entities to serve church interests, essentially weaponizing the very forces they publicly condemned. This practice involved what church records call binding contracts with infernal powers, agreements where church authorities claim to have negotiated deals with demonic entities in exchange for supernatural assistance. These contracts were written documents that survived in church archives, containing specific terms and conditions for demonic cooperation. The contracts reveal that church authorities believed they could command supernatural forces to spy on enemies, influence political decisions, and even cause illness or death in specific individuals. While modern analysis suggests these beliefs were delusional, the contracts show that church authorities were willing to engage in what they themselves considered evil practices when it served their institutional interests. They developed elaborate justifications for these contracts, claiming that commanding demons to serve holy purposes was different from actual demonic worship. These powers required specific conditions that reveal the calculated nature of church operations. Victims had to be weakened through starvation and torture to make them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. Ceremonies were performed during celestial alignments not because of supernatural significance, but because these dates provided convenient scheduling that allowed church authorities to coordinate activities across multiple locations. Most critically, the presence of untainted souls whose suffering could supposedly amplify the rituals' effectiveness provided justification for targeting the most vulnerable members of society. The clergy who wielded these abilities operated in complete secrecy, answering only to Vatican authorities who maintained plausible deniability while reaping the benefits of their supernatural intelligence network. This created a system where local church officials could engage in extreme abuse while higher authorities could claim ignorance of specific activities. The supernatural claims provided perfect cover for what was actually a sophisticated criminal organization that used religious authority to justify practices that would have been considered horrific even by medieval standards. Beyond the literal horror lies a more disturbing truth that reveals these rituals as the ultimate corruption of spiritual authority for temporal power. And understanding their symbolic meaning helps explain how similar patterns of institutional abuse continue to this day. The medieval church's occult practices symbolize humanity's most dangerous tendency, the transformation of sacred trust into instruments of control that destroy the very people they claim to protect. These clergy didn't battle demons, they became them, using fear of the supernatural to maintain absolute authority over medieval society while engaging in practices that were far more evil than anything they claimed to be fighting against. The symbolism is unmistakable and deeply disturbing when examined closely. Exorcism chambers beneath cathedrals represent the shadow self of organized religion, the darkness that grows when spiritual power becomes separated from spiritual accountability. These underground torture chambers weren't accidents of architecture but deliberate, symbolic statements about hidden power operating beneath the surface of public righteousness. The physical positioning of these chambers, directly below sacred spaces, represents the psychological reality of institutional corruption, evil literally lurking beneath the foundation of supposed holiness. Church architects deliberately designed these spaces to mirror the layout of the cathedrals above them, creating twisted versions of sacred spaces where torture replaced prayer and screaming replaced hymns. This wasn't coincidence but intentional symbolism designed to reinforce the church's claim that they controlled both salvation and damnation, both healing and destruction. The torture disguised as purification mirrors how institutions corrupt noble ideals to serve base desires for control and dominance. Every technique used in these chambers was presented as necessary for spiritual healing, creating a symbolic inversion where suffering became salvation and pain became prayer. This symbolic framework was crucial for maintaining the psychological control that made these practices possible. Victims couldn't resist what they were told was divine will, and observers couldn't protest what was presented as holy necessity. Most chilling is what these rituals reveal about systematic abuse of innocence and how institutions use spiritual authority to target the most vulnerable members of society. The Church's targeting of children and vulnerable individuals wasn't random but strategic. Based on the symbolic power of corrupting innocence, Church documents reveal that clergy believed destroying innocence was the most effective way to demonstrate supernatural power, creating a symbolic framework where the violation of the pure became proof of divine authority. This represents the archetypal betrayal that appears throughout human history, the shepherd becoming the wolf, the protector becoming the predator. The symbolic impact goes beyond individual trauma to represent the destruction of trust itself. When institutions that claim moral authority engage in the very behaviors they condemn, they don't just harm their immediate victims but destroy society's ability to distinguish between good and evil, creating moral confusion that can last for generations. The medieval Church's use of religious symbolism to justify torture created what psychologists now recognize as a form of spiritual abuse that's particularly damaging because it corrupts the victim's understanding of morality itself. Victims couldn't process what was happening to them because their torturers used the same symbols and language associated with salvation and protection. This created a psychological prison where the very concepts meant to provide comfort became sources of terror. The symbolic meaning extends to the institutional level, revealing how organizations use claims of higher purpose to justify practices that serve only their own power. The Church presented these rituals as necessary for protecting society from supernatural evil, but the evidence shows they were actually tools for eliminating opposition and gathering intelligence. The symbolic framework of fighting demons provided perfect cover for destroying enemies, as anyone who opposed Church authority could be labeled as possessed or influenced by evil forces. This represents a warning about what happens when any institution claims exclusive access to truth while operating beyond external oversight. The medieval Church's symbolic authority came from their claim to be the only legitimate intermediary between humanity and the divine. This exclusive access allowed them to redefine good and evil according to their institutional needs, creating a symbolic framework where anything that served Church interests became holy by definition, regardless of how horrific it actually was. The danger isn't just historical but eternal. As these symbolic patterns repeat throughout human history, whenever institutions combine moral authority with secretive operations, the symbolic elements that made medieval Church abuse possible, claims of exclusive truth, demands for unquestioning obedience, secret operations justified by higher purpose, and the targeting of vulnerable populations appear in every major institutional abuse scandal throughout history. These practices remind us that the greatest evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that unchecked spiritual authority inevitably corrupts into its opposite. The symbolic power of religious authority makes it particularly dangerous when corrupted, because it can reframe the most horrific acts as sacred duties. The medieval Church's ability to present torture as healing and murder as salvation demonstrates how symbolic frameworks can be weaponized to make the unthinkable seem not just acceptable but necessary. The medieval Church's occult rituals weren't aberrations but the logical conclusion of combining absolute power with zero accountability, and their symbolic meaning reveals patterns that continue to appear whenever institutions claim moral authority, while rejecting external oversight. The symbolic elements that enabled these historical horrors, the sacred spaces, hiding secret chambers, the holy symbols used to justify unholy acts, the religious language used to describe criminal behavior provide a template for recognizing institutional abuse that transcends specific religious or cultural contexts. Understanding these symbolic patterns is crucial because they reveal how institutions manipulate spiritual and moral authority to create psychological environments where abuse becomes normalized and resistance becomes impossible. The medieval Church's symbolic framework didn't just enable individual acts of cruelty, but created entire systems where cruelty was redefined as compassion, where destruction was presented as salvation, and where the worst human impulses were elevated to sacred duties. This symbolic inversion of moral reality represents one of the most dangerous tools available to corrupt institutions, and recognizing these patterns is essential for protecting vulnerable populations from similar abuse in any context. The legacy of these medieval practices finds disturbing echoes in modern revelations about institutional abuse and cover-ups that continue to this day, revealing that the patterns established centuries ago remain virtually unchanged in contemporary religious institutions. Recent investigations like the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, released in 2018, and the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse have uncovered systematic patterns that mirror medieval practices with frightening accuracy, the same secrecy protocols, the same targeting of vulnerable individuals, and the same institutional protection of perpetrators over victims. The Pennsylvania report alone documented over 1,000 identifiable victims and 300 predator priests across 6 dioceses. But investigators estimated the actual numbers were much higher due to destroyed records and institutional cover-ups. What makes this directly relevant to our medieval discussion is how the report revealed that church officials used the same justification techniques that medieval clergy employed, presenting abuse as spiritual correction, using religious authority to silence victims, and claiming that institutional protection was necessary for the greater good of the faith. The setup remains virtually unchanged from medieval times, an institution claiming moral authority while operating beyond civilian oversight. Modern Vatican policies regarding abuse, investigations, echo medieval protocols with disturbing precision. The Church still maintains its own internal tribunals that operate in secret, still keeps sealed records that are never shared with civil authorities, and still transfers problematic clergy to new territories rather than facing accountability. The 2019 papal decree Vos Estis Lux Mundi requires reporting of abuse to church authorities, but specifically exempts cases where civil law doesn't require reporting, creating the same loopholes that medieval church law provided. Disturbing is how these historical practices establish templates for institutional abuse that persist across centuries with minimal modification. The psychological techniques developed in medieval torture chambers, isolation from family and support systems, religious manipulation that confuses victims about right and wrong, shame-based control that makes victims blame themselves, and the confusion of suffering with salvation appear repeatedly in modern abuse cases with such consistency that it suggests deliberate institutional knowledge being passed down through church hierarchy. The Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation revealed that Cardinal Bernard Law used techniques that were identical to medieval practices, moving abusive priests to new parishes without warning. The communities, using church resources to silence victims through legal intimidation, and most tellingly, using religious language to reframe criminal behavior as spiritual weakness that required prayer rather than prosecution. When victims came forward, church officials used the same spiritual manipulation tactics that medieval clergy employed, telling victims that forgiveness was their Christian duty and that pursuing justice would harm the broader church community. The deception operates on multiple levels that mirror exactly how medieval authorities functioned. Publicly, the church maintains its image as protector of innocence, while privately, institutional policies prioritize reputation management over victim protection. This dual reality was revealed in internal church documents discovered during the Irish Murphy Report investigation, which showed that church officials were simultaneously running public campaigns about child protection, while secretly relocating known predators to positions with access to children. The Murphy Report uncovered evidence that the Dublin Archdiocese had maintained detailed secret files on abusive priests since the 1960s. Files that contained information about specific victims, specific crimes, and specific cover-up strategies. These files were kept in a special archive that only certain high-ranking officials could access, creating the same kind of secret knowledge networks that medieval clergy maintained in their underground chambers. The files revealed that church officials tracked the effectiveness of different manipulation techniques, noting which approaches were most successful at silencing victims and which were most effective at maintaining public denial. The victims' experience remains tragically consistent across centuries, revealing how little has changed in institutional abuse patterns. Trusted authority figures exploit sacred relationships by using religious language and spiritual concepts to confuse victims about the nature of what's happening to them. Victims describe being told that their abuse was God's will, that suffering would bring them closer to Christ, and that reporting their experiences would damage their own souls and the souls of others. These are exact echoes of the spiritual manipulation that medieval clergy used to control their victims. Modern survivors report the same psychological confusion that medieval victims experienced, suffering inflicted by those claiming to offer salvation, religious concepts being weaponized against them, and institutional gaslighting that makes victims question their own reality and their own worth. The Australian Royal Commission documented cases where victims were told their abuse was punishment for their sins, that they had tempted holy men into sin, and that seeking justice would damn their souls. Spiritual manipulation techniques that are identical to those described in medieval church documents. These patterns reveal that the medieval church's occult practices weren't historical anomalies, but were the foundation of systematic abuse that continues because the same power structures, secrecy protocols, and lack of external accountability remain intact. The 2020 McCarrick Report demonstrated how these medieval patterns operate at the highest levels of church hierarchy, revealing that Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's decades of abuse were known to Vatican officials who used the same protection strategies that medieval church authorities employed: secret transfers, confidential settlements, and public denial combined with private acknowledgement. The institutional response to modern revelations follows. the exact same patterns established in medieval times. When abuse is exposed, church officials claim surprise and ignorance while internal documents reveal detailed knowledge of ongoing problems. They promised reform while fighting against external oversight. They express concern for victims while using legal strategies designed to minimize financial liability rather than provide genuine accountability. They claim to be addressing spiritual problems while treating abuse as a public relations challenge rather than a criminal justice issue. The deeper message is clear and deeply disturbing. Institutions that claim divine authority while rejecting human oversight will inevitably corrupt, and the most vulnerable will always pay the price for our failure to learn from history's darkest lessons. The medieval church's development of systematic abuse techniques created institutional knowledge that has been preserved and refined over centuries, passed down through church hierarchy like a dark tradition that operates parallel to official religious teaching. The disturbing rituals of the medieval church ultimately reflect humanity's most dangerous tendency, the corruption of sacred trust into instruments of terror and control that destroy the very people institutions claim to protect. These historical practices serve as more than just shocking stories from the past. They provide crucial insight into how institutional evil operates and why it persists across centuries despite repeated exposure and supposed reform. These practices remind us that no institution, regardless of its claimed divine authority or moral mission, should operate beyond human accountability or external oversight. The medieval church's occult rituals weren't the work of a few bad actors or the result of ignorance about better methods. They were the systematic result of absolute power exercised in absolute secrecy, combined with ideological frameworks that justified any action as long as it served institutional interests. The symbolic importance transcends religious boundaries and applies to any organization that combines moral authority with secretive operations. These historical horrors represent what happens when we allow any institution to police itself, to claim exclusive access to truth, and to operate beyond the scrutiny of those it claims to serve. The patterns established by medieval church abuse appear in every major institutional scandal throughout history, from political organizations to educational institutions to corporate structures that claim to serve higher purposes while protecting their own power. Perhaps most chilling is how these practices reveal the human capacity for self-deception and moral rationalization when it serves our interests or confirms our worldview. Clergy who genuinely believed they served God while torturing innocents demonstrate how easily we rationalize evil when it comes from trusted authority figures, or when it's presented in language that appeals to our desire to be part of something greater than ourselves. The medieval church's ability to present torture as healing and murder as salvation shows how moral frameworks can be weaponized to make people complicit in their own destruction. The psychological techniques developed in medieval torture chambers, using shame to silence victims, isolating targets from support systems, creating dependency on abusive authority figures, and reframing suffering as spiritual growth appear in modern institutional abuse with such consistency that it suggests these aren't accidental similarities but evidence of preserved institutional knowledge. The same methods that medieval clergy used to break their victims are employed by modern institutions that want to maintain control while avoiding accountability. What makes this particularly relevant today is how these historical patterns help us recognize institutional abuse before it reaches the extreme levels documented in medieval records. The warning signs are consistent across centuries. Institutions that demand unquestioning loyalty, that operate in unnecessary secrecy, that claim moral authority while rejecting external oversight, that target vulnerable populations while claiming to protect them, and that respond to criticism by attacking accusers rather than addressing accusations. The medieval church's dark rituals serve as an eternal warning about what happens when institutions combine claims of moral authority with demands for unquestioning obedience, when secrecy is justified by claims of higher purpose, when the vulnerable are sacrificed to protect the powerful, and when accountability is rejected in favor of institutional preservation. We haven't learned from history when we allow these patterns to repeat. We've simply enabled them to evolve and adapt to contemporary circumstances while maintaining their essential destructive nature. The price of ignoring these lessons isn't just historical, it's paid by every generation that fails to demand transparency, accountability, and protection for the innocent over preservation of institutional power. The medieval church's systematic abuse created templates that continue to operate in modern institutions because the fundamental dynamics of power, secrecy, and moral authority remain unchanged. Understanding these historical patterns is essential for protecting vulnerable populations from similar abuse and for preventing the kind of institutional corruption that destroys both individuals and the social trust that makes civilization possible. If this exploration into the church's forbidden history has opened your eyes to how much remains hidden from us, and how historical patterns of institutional abuse continue to operate in modern institutions, you're exactly where you need to be as someone who refuses to accept official narratives without questioning the darker realities they often conceal. Hit that like button if this investigation revealed something you never knew about how institutions use spiritual authority to justify systematic abuse. And subscribe to Sigil Sanctum. We're dedicated to uncovering the occult secrets and hidden histories that powerful organizations don't want exposed. Our mission isn't just entertainment, but education about the patterns of institutional corruption that repeat throughout history because people refuse to learn from past horrors. What we've uncovered today about medieval church practices isn't just historical curiosity but a warning about how institutions operate when they're allowed to combine moral authority with secretive operations and zero external accountability. These patterns appear in every major institutional abuse scandal throughout history, and recognizing them is essential for protecting vulnerable populations from similar treatment in contemporary organizations. Our channel is dedicated to illuminating the darkness that powerful institutions try to keep buried. From ancient ritual practices to modern cover-ups that shape our world today, we don't just expose historical horrors, but connect them to ongoing patterns that help explain why institutional abuse continues. Despite repeated exposure and promised reform, understanding these connections is crucial for anyone who wants to protect themselves and others from institutional manipulation and abuse. Next week, we're diving into another institution's hidden occult connections that will challenge everything you thought you knew about organized power and how supposedly moral authorities operate when they think nobody is watching. We'll be examining how these medieval church practices established templates that influenced not just religious institutions, but political and educational organizations that claim to serve the public good, while operating according to the same secretive, unaccountable principles. Until then, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, the truth is always more disturbing than the official story. And the most dangerous institutions are often those that claim the highest moral authority, while rejecting the most basic accountability. This is Sigil Sanctum, signing off from the shadows where real knowledge lives and where the patterns of power reveal themselves to those willing to look beyond comfortable illusions.